The envelope was sitting on my kitchen counter when I woke up at 6 in the morning, which meant my contact had let himself in again. I stood in the doorway of my small apartment kitchen in boxers and a wrinkled t-shirt, staring at it the way you stare at something you already know is going to ruin your life. Brown envelope, no return address, my name written in block capitals, Stuart Gill. Like I needed reminding. I made coffee first. That was a rule I had for myself. Never open anything that might change the course of your life before you've had at least one cup. The machine gurgled and hissed and spat out something dark and bitter that matched my general outlook, and I stood at the window looking down at the street while I drank it. It was autumn. The trees had gone red and gold, and there were pigeons on the opposite roof, doing whatever pigeons do at 6 in the morning. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper with a company name, an address, and a job posting printed from the internet. The job posting was for a mid-level data analyst position at a firm called Marks & Meridian Consulting. The salary was decent, the benefits looked reasonable. There was a handwritten note paperclipped to the top in a handwriting I recognized and had learned to distrust. We need someone inside. 6 months. Everything you find on the Ventana contracts goes straight to us. Do not engage personally with Joshua Marks. In and out. I read it twice, then I folded it back up, finished my coffee, and called my contact. 6 months, I said, when he picked up. Morning to you too, Stuart. 6 months in a consulting firm pretending to be a data analyst. You are a data analyst. I used to be a data analyst. Now I'm a data analyst who does freelance work for people who pay very well, he said, with the particular smoothness of someone who has never had to pretend to enjoy a job in his life. Marks & Meridian has government contracts we believe are being misused, specifically the Ventana contracts. There are irregularities. We need documentation. And Joshua Marks? There was a pause. He runs the company. Inherited it from his father 3 years ago. He's 32, very well connected, charming, and quite possibly fully aware of what's happening with the contracts. Do not get close to him. I wasn't planning to get close to anyone. Good. The job application has already been submitted under your name. They'll call you by end of week. He hung up before I could say anything else. I set down the phone and looked at the envelope again. The morning light had shifted, and the apartment felt quieter than usual. Outside, the pigeons were gone. I was a freelance data analyst who occasionally did work that was not strictly legal and not strictly illegal either. It existed in a gray space that I'd made my home for the past 4 years, ever since I'd left the corporate world with a bad taste in my mouth and a very specific set of skills that turned out to be useful to people who needed things found out quietly. I was good at it. I was also, if I was being honest with myself, lonely in the particular way that people are lonely when they've built their life out of leaving before anyone gets too close. 6 months undercover at a consulting firm sounded, in the abstract, like exactly the kind of thing I could manage. In practice, it was going to be more complicated than that. It always was. The call came on Thursday, exactly as promised. The woman on the phone had a warm, efficient voice and told me they'd been very impressed by my CV, and would I be available for an interview on Monday? I said yes. She gave me an address in a part of the city that I vaguely knew. Glass buildings, coffee shops, the kind of neighborhood where everyone looked like they were in a hurry to be somewhere important. I spent the weekend preparing. I read everything publicly available about Marks & Meridian, which was quite a lot. They'd had a good few years of press coverage for their work on public sector consulting contracts, mostly laudatory, a few pieces asking harder questions that seemed to have gone nowhere. I found 3 separate profiles of Joshua Marks, all of them painting more or less the same picture. Youngest partner ever at his father's firm. Took over completely after the elder Marks had a stroke. Doubled revenue in 2 years. Known for being both demanding and fair. One journalist described him as having the kind of charisma that makes you want to work harder just to keep his attention. I noted that and filed it under things to be careful of. His photographs confirmed the charisma, at least visually. Dark eyes, a jaw like someone had designed it with a ruler. He smiled in exactly one of the 3 photos, and even in a small press headshot. It was the kind of smile that made the photo feel warmer than it had any right to be. I closed my laptop and reminded myself that I was going in there to find evidence of contract fraud, not to develop opinions about Joshua Marks's smile. The interview was on the 14th floor of a building with a lobby full of plants and a receptionist who smiled at me like I was already part of the team. I was met by a woman named Priya, who had sharp eyes and a ponytail so precise it looked architectural. She walked me through 2 rounds, first with her, then with the head of the data team, a quiet man named Callum, who asked very good technical questions and seemed genuinely pleased when I answered them correctly. I was good at interviews. It was one of the skills that had made me useful in this particular line of work. You learn to read a room fast, to calibrate yourself to what's wanted, to be simultaneously impressive and unthreatening. By the end of the 2nd round, Callum was leaning forward slightly, which meant I had him. Then the 3rd round happened. I hadn't been expecting a 3rd round. Priya came back into the room with an expression that was politely apologetic and said Joshua would like to meet you briefly if you have a few more minutes. Not a question, not really. I had a few more minutes. I always had a few more minutes. He came into the room about 4 minutes later, which was long enough for me to have decided I was perfectly calm about this, and short enough that the calmness wasn't entirely convincing. Joshua Marks in person was different for these photographs. Not more attractive. The photographs had done a fair job of capturing that, but more present somehow. He walked into the room with the ease of someone who has never once in his adult life walked into a room and worried about what people thought of him. And he sat down across from me and looked at me with those dark eyes and said, without preamble, "Your background is unusual." "In what way?" I asked. "You left a very good position at Hargreaves Analytics 4 years ago. No explanation on your CV. Then 4 years of freelance work, good clients, solid results, but nothing you'd expect to see from someone with your level of skill. Most people would have gone after a senior position." He tilted his head slightly. "Why didn't you?" It was a good question. It was in fact a slightly too good question for a brief 3rd-round interview chat, and it told me immediately that Joshua Marks did his own research. I gave him the answer I'd prepared, something true enough to be convincing, about wanting flexibility, about a bad experience with corporate culture that had made me value autonomy. He listened without interrupting, which was more than most people did, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I value autonomy too," he said. "I also value people who say what they mean. We'll offer you the position." And that was that. The handshake at the end was firm and brief and entirely professional, and I walked out of the building into the autumn afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment, feeling something I hadn't quite expected. Not guilt, not yet. Something quieter than that. The particular feeling of having stepped through a door that you know you won't be able to come back through the same way. I called my contact and said, "I'm in." My first week at Marks and Meridian was an exercise in performing normality, which I was very good at. The data team was small, 6 of us, including Callum, who turned out to be the kind of manager who trusted you immediately and made you feel guilty about it. There was Danny, who was 24 and had strong opinions about everything from data visualization to the correct way to make tea, and who had adopted me as a friend before I'd finished unpacking my desk. There was Marcus, quiet and meticulous, who communicated mainly through extremely precise emails. There was Yolanda, who had been with the company for 9 years and knew where every body was buried, metaphorically speaking, and who I could tell immediately was someone I would need to be very careful around. And there was Ben, who was 27 and extremely funny, and who I liked despite myself, which was already a problem. I liked all of them, which was the first unexpected complication. I had done this kind of work before, in environments that were easy to stay detached from, companies with flat beige cultures, places where no one talked to each other, where the work was dry and the people were interchangeable. Marks and Meridian was not like that. By the end of my first week, Danny had made me part of the unofficial Friday lunch group. Callum had asked my opinion on a methodology question and genuinely considered my answer, and Ben had made me laugh until I spilled coffee on my keyboard, which hadn't happened to me in years. Joshua Marks I saw exactly twice that week, once in the corridor, where he nodded at me without breaking his stride. He moved through the office the way a weather system moves, drawing the attention of the room without apparently noticing it. Once in a brief all-hands meeting where he gave a company update that was precise and unsentimental and contained a dry joke at the very end that made half the room laugh and the other half scramble to catch up. He did not look at me specifically during the meeting. I was aware of this with a precision that annoyed me. In the evenings, I wrote up my notes, The Ventana contracts. I'd found references to them already, in the shared drives I had access to as a data analyst. Nothing incriminating yet. Procedural documents, budget summaries, the kind of material you'd expect. I flagged what I could and sent encrypted files to my contact. Nothing yet, I told him. It's your first week, he said. Keep going. The second complication arrived in week 3 in the form of a project assignment. Callum called me into his office and told me I was being moved to a cross-departmental task force for a major government contract review. The project was called Meridian Blue, and it involved data analysis across 3 departments and direct reporting to the leadership team. It's a big opportunity, Callum said, with the particular warmth of someone who has given you good news and wants you to know they're on your side. Joshua specifically asked for our best analyst. I processed this information carefully. Specifically me? He saw your work on the Q3 housing data, said it was the cleanest methodology he'd seen on a public sector dataset in 3 years. I thanked him. I walked back to my desk. I sat down. Then I opened my encrypted messaging app and typed, "I've been moved to a cross-departmental project, direct reporting to leadership. This is either a very good development or a very bad one." The response came back quickly. "Stay close. This is what we need." Easy for him to say. Meridian Blue had a dedicated meeting room on the 15th floor, which was the floor where the partners' offices were, and which I had previously had no legitimate reason to visit. There were 5 of us on the task force. Me, a woman from the policy team named Adrian, who had a precise, careful manner that reminded me of Marcus, a finance analyst named Tom who talked too much and meant well, and 2 others from the strategy side whose names I took careful note of, and Joshua Marks, who was leading the project himself. He arrived on the first morning at exactly the time he'd said he would, sat down, and opened the meeting by saying what the project was, what it wasn't, and what he expected from each of us in terms of output and communication. It was the most efficient project kickoff I had ever witnessed. No unnecessary framing, no performed enthusiasm, just clear information, clear expectations, and then the floor was open. I found myself taking notes, real notes, not the coded kind. The thing about working closely with someone you've been told to watch is that the watching becomes very complicated very quickly. By the end of the second week on Meridian Blue, I had built a fairly detailed picture of how Joshua Marks operated. He prepared thoroughly and expected the same from others. He asked hard questions and seemed genuinely interested in the answers, which was rarer than it should be. He did not tolerate vague or evasive responses, not rudely, but with a patient, implacable precision that made evasion feel exhausting rather than safe. He remembered details about every project and every person involved in a way that suggested either an extraordinary memory or an extraordinary discipline, possibly both. He was also funny, in a dry, unexpected way that he deployed rarely enough that it felt like a gift when it happened. The 4th time he made me laugh in a meeting. A perfectly timed response to Tom's 3rd attempt to explain something the rest of us had understood on the 1st attempt. I realized I was in significantly more trouble than I had planned for. Not the falling in love kind of trouble, not yet, but the kind of trouble that comes from genuinely respecting someone you have lied to in order to get close to. That evening I sat in my apartment and looked at the notes I'd been sending to my contact, and felt something that took me a while to name. It wasn't quite guilt. It was more like the sensation of standing on something that had seemed solid and was beginning to feel less so. I sent my notes anyway. There was nothing new about the Ventana contract specifically. I had access to more documentation now, and what I could see was suggestive of irregularity, but not conclusive. I needed more time, and I needed to go deeper into the financial records, which meant I needed more trust. More trust meant more proximity. More proximity meant I stopped that line of thinking and went to bed. It was a Tuesday in my 5th week when I found the first real thread. I was cross-referencing budget allocations in the Ventana contract files. Dry, careful work. The kind that required a quiet environment and a lot of patience. When I noticed a discrepancy in a series of subcontractor payments. Not large. Barely visible, in fact, if you weren't specifically looking for the pattern. But I was specifically looking, and I saw it. A sequence of payments to a company called Varel Services that didn't appear in any of the official contractor directories, that were categorized in a way that was technically within the rules, but practically designed to be hard to trace. My heart did something unsteady. I sat very still for a moment, looking at the numbers on the screen. Then I did what any conscientious data analyst would do. I opened a new document and began a careful, methodical documentation of everything I could find. Not because I was being paid to spy on this company, because I was sitting in this building, working alongside these people, and something was wrong, and I had always had a fundamental inability to look away from wrong things. I kept working until 7 in the evening. Everyone else had left by 6. The office was quiet, just the hum of the building's ventilation and the distant sound of cleaning crews on other floors. I was so absorbed that I didn't hear the door. "You're here late." I startled, which I almost never did. Joshua Marks was standing in the doorway of the open plan office with his jacket over his arm and the kind of expression that suggested he'd been standing there for a few seconds before speaking. "Sorry," I said, which was not a useful response. I glanced at my screen, which was showing the Ventana spreadsheets, and felt the particular cold clarity of someone who has been caught doing something they needed not to be caught doing. Following a thread in the contract data, couldn't quite leave it. He walked over to his own glass-walled office at the far end. I could see the light of his desk lamp already on, which meant he'd been there, I just hadn't heard him, and set his jacket over his chair. Then he came back out and stood at a conversational distance from my desk. "Which thread?" "Careful. Subcontractor classification. Some of the budget categorization looked off to me. Probably nothing." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone dismissing what you said, but the quiet of someone running it through their head. "Show me." The next 40 minutes were the most careful conversation of my professional life. I showed him what I'd found, keeping it to the surface-level discrepancy and not the full extent of what I'd been mapping. He asked precise, focused questions. I answered honestly about the parts I could afford to, and deflected smoothly on the parts I couldn't. Halfway through, he pulled a chair over and sat down beside me, and the proximity made it harder to maintain the careful emotional distance I'd been practicing for 5 weeks. He smelled like coffee and something else, very faint. Sandalwood, maybe. I noticed this with the particular resentment of someone who would have preferred not to notice. "This is good work," he said, at the end. "Flag it formally through Callum. I want it documented properly." Of course, he stood, pushed the chair back to its original position, and looked down at me. "You've been here 6 weeks and you're still here at 7 on a Tuesday." "I don't have anywhere more important to be," I said, which was true in a way that suddenly felt much heavier than it normally did. Something crossed his face, too quick for me to read clearly. "Me either," he said. "Then, go home, Stuart. The numbers will still be wrong tomorrow." He went back to his office. I closed my laptop and sat for a moment in the dim light of the office, listening to the ventilation hum, feeling like something had shifted in a way I hadn't authorized. I started noticing things I hadn't meant to notice. The way he took his coffee, black, no sugar, always in the same mug that lived on his desk, and that he washed himself at the small kitchen on the 15th floor, which I learned when I went up to that kitchen for the first time and found him there at 8:15 on a Wednesday morning, sleeves rolled up, washing his mug with the focused attention of someone who applies full effort to everything, including domestic tasks. We talked for 11 minutes about a methodology question he was working through. It was one of the most unexpectedly engaging 11 minutes of that month, and I thought about it on the train home. The way he listened, not passively, not with the half attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with his whole focus, which was a slightly unnerving quantity of focus to be on the receiving end of when you had several significant things to hide. The way he treated the people around him. I had been watching this carefully since the beginning, partly because it was relevant to my assessment of his character for professional purposes, and partly because I was finding it increasingly relevant for other purposes. He was exacting with work and generous with credit. He pushed back when he disagreed and gave way when he was wrong, which happened rarely and was acknowledged without drama. He remembered things: Danny's grandmother's health, Ben's sister's wedding, Adrienne's particular discomfort with the lighting in the meeting room on the south side, and the quiet way he'd had it adjusted without making a thing of it. I had built a file on Joshua Marks for my contact. It was supposed to be an intelligence summary. What it had become was something that made me deeply uncomfortable to look at, because it was the most thorough character study I had ever produced, and the character it described was one I had no framework for fitting into the story I'd told myself about why I was here. In week 8, my contact called and asked for an update on the Ventana thread. I sat on the roof terrace of my building, which was empty in the November cold, and gave him a careful account of what I'd found. "That's enough for a preliminary report," he said. "We may be able to move sooner than expected." "Move how?" "Formal investigation. We'd need you to provide documentation you've been able to access internally. That documentation is privileged. You've been given access to it as an employee who was placed there under false pretenses." There was a pause. "Stuart, that's always been the case. This isn't new information." It wasn't new information. It was somehow landing differently than it had in week 1. "Give me more time," I said. "What I have isn't clean yet. I want to be certain about the Viral Services thread before it goes anywhere official. If it's not what we think it is, you're going after a company that hasn't done anything wrong." He accepted this. Probably because it was professionally sound reasoning, even if it wasn't the only reason I was making it. I sat on the roof for another 10 minutes after he hung up, looking at the dark city, breathing cold air, and conducting a very honest internal conversation with myself about what was happening and why. The conclusion of the conversation was not comfortable. The conclusion was that I had been in this company for 2 months, and I had stopped thinking of it as a target and started thinking of it as a place. I had stopped thinking of these people as subjects and started thinking of them as colleagues. And I had stopped thinking of Joshua Marks as a person of interest and started thinking of him as something else, something that made Tuesday evenings in an empty office feel like they mattered, and Monday mornings something to move toward rather than through. This was a problem. It happened the way things you've been avoiding happen, not all at once, but in accumulation, until one small moment tips the balance and you find yourself somewhere you didn't plan to be. Week 9, there was a late afternoon project review that ran long, and by the time it ended, it was nearly 7:30 and the building had mostly emptied. Tom had left halfway through for a prior commitment. Adrian had stayed for the whole thing and left immediately after, with the determined walk of someone who had trains to catch. I was gathering my things, half thinking about what I'd eat when I got home, when Joshua said, from his seat at the head of the table, "Are you hungry?" I looked up. He was still sitting there with a pen in his hand and his jacket over the back of his chair. And there was something slightly careful in the way he'd asked the question, not his usual directness, something slightly more tentative than that. I could eat. "There's a place 3 streets over. Nothing impressive, but they know what they're doing with noodles. Noodles sound fine." We walked 3 streets over through cold November air, close enough that our shoulders occasionally brushed, far enough apart to be entirely work appropriate, and we talked about the project. Or we started talking about the project. Somewhere around the middle of the 2nd street, the conversation shifted, the way conversations do when 2 people have been working alongside each other long enough that the professional surface starts to thin. He asked me about the Hargreaves Analytics job I'd left. I told him the version I'd told him before, the one that was true enough. He listened with that focused attention and then said, "You left something you were good at because it didn't fit you. That's harder than it sounds." "Was it hard for you?" I asked, taking over the company. He thought about this for a moment, which I was coming to recognize as a genuine thing. He actually thought before he answered, rather than producing a prepared response. "My father built it. For a long time I thought that meant I'd inherited something I had to protect, exactly as it was." He paused. "Then I realized that was never what he'd built it for. He'd built something he believed in. To honor that, I had to be willing to change it." The noodle place was warm and busy and very good, and we sat at a small table by the window and talked for 2 hours. Not about work, not mostly, about the things you discover about a person when you give them your full attention, and they do the same for you. The small reveals of preference and history and humor that build a picture of someone from the inside out. He had studied philosophy before he'd gone into business, which surprised me and then didn't. He ran early in the mornings, though he called it a compulsion rather than a choice. He had one sibling, a younger sister he spoke about with unguarded warmth, which was a side of him I hadn't seen in the professional context. He found silence more comfortable than noise. He had very strong feelings about the correct way to approach a difficult problem, which were feelings I shared, and we argued about this, pleasantly, the way you argue with someone who is your equal, for about 15 minutes over the last of the noodles. I told him things too, true things, carefully chosen, enough to feel like reciprocity. The work was easy, it was the selection that was hard. We parted on the pavement outside the restaurant, and he said, "Good evening, steward," in a tone that I turned over in my mind on the train home and again, lying in bed until past midnight. There was nothing wrong with what had just happened. Two colleagues, dinner after a long meeting, a conversation that had been wonderful. The word I was avoiding was wonderful. After that, things became both easier and harder in equal measure. Easier because the professional collaboration, which had already been good, became genuinely excellent. We had found the particular frequency on which two minds worked together well, and working at that frequency produced something better than either of us could have done alone. The Meridian Blue project was the best work I had done in years. I was not pretending in those sessions. I couldn't afford to, and besides, I didn't want to. Harder because of all the parts I was pretending in. The Viral Services thread had deepened. I was now fairly certain that someone, not necessarily Joshua, not necessarily anyone at the senior level, was routing funds through a subcontractor network in a way that was benefiting a third party I hadn't been able to identify yet. The irregularities in the Ventana contracts were consistent and patterned in a way that didn't look like accident. But I was also finding, the more deeply I looked, that the trails did not lead where my contact had suggested they would. They didn't lead to the senior leadership of Marks and Meridian. They led to a layer below, to a mid-level operations manager named Greaves, who had joined 2 years ago, and whose access to certain contract documents was both broader than his role warranted and narrower than it would need to be for senior direction. I was beginning to think that my contact's original theory, that Joshua Marks was complicit, possibly directing, was wrong. I was also beginning to care about whether it was wrong in a way that I recognized and was profoundly uncomfortable with. One Thursday afternoon in my 3rd month, I was working late on the 15th floor. I had graduated by this point to a desk in the strategy wing adjacent to the partners' offices, an informal arrangement that no one had explicitly sanctioned, but that had emerged naturally from the project work, when Danny appeared at the door looking faintly stricken. "There are forms," she said, "the Q4 reporting forms. Callan forgot to tell me they changed the submission process, and now I have about 4 hours of rework." "I'll help," I said immediately. "You don't have to. Danny, sit down." We worked through it together, side by side at the desk she'd pulled up next to mine, and halfway through she said, without looking up from her screen, "Can I ask you something personal?" I was immediately wary, in the particular way that people with things to hide are wary of personal questions. "Sure. Do you like it here?" Not what I'd expected. "Yes," I said, and the simplicity of the answer caught me slightly off guard, because it was completely true. "Why?" "Because you seemed, at the beginning, like someone who was waiting to leave," she said, "like someone who expected to be disappointed." She glanced sideways at me. "You seem different now." I looked at my screen for a moment. "Maybe I am," I said. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to the forms. I sat with the weight of what she'd said for a long moment. The thing was, she was right. I had arrived in this building expecting it to be a job I was doing, rather than a place I was in, expecting to be somewhere else in my head, even while my body sat at the desk and my hands did the work. I had planned for the performance of belonging, without anticipating that belonging might become something other than a performance. It had happened gradually and without my permission, the way real things happen, the way you notice one day that a place has become home, not because you decided it would be, but because home is something that accumulates. Shared lunches and running arguments about methodology, and the particular quality of light in the meeting room on the south side on a clear winter afternoon, and the sound of a specific person's voice 3 offices away saying something that makes you want to hear what comes next. It was a Friday evening in my 13th week, nearly the end of the 4th month, when I walked into an empty meeting room on the 15th floor to retrieve a laptop I'd left there and found Joshua standing at the window with his back to me, which was unusual enough that I stopped. "Sorry," I said. "I left my—" "It's fine." He didn't turn around. There was something in his posture that was different from his usual self. A tightness, a stillness that read as something being contained rather than natural calm. I should have got my laptop and left. I did not get my laptop and leave. "Bad day?" I asked instead. He turned from the window. In the low light of the room, the overheads were off, just the ambient light from the city outside and the faint glow from the corridor. His face was less guarded than I'd seen it. He looked tired in a way that went below the surface. There are things happening in the company that I don't fully understand, he said, and I find that harder than most things. I sat down in one of the meeting room chairs because it seemed like the thing to do. He looked at me for a moment, as if deciding something, and then sat down across from me, not at the end of the table, just across it. The way we sat in the small noodle place, close enough to talk properly. The Vantana contracts? I asked, and watched something sharpen in his face. You've noticed something? I've been looking at the data. Professionally, I added carefully. The Viral Services subcontractor thread. He was quiet for a long moment. Tell me what you found. And here is the place in the story where I made a choice. The most consequential choice of the 4 months I'd been there, and possibly of much longer than that. I could have kept the surface level, the same careful half-disclosure I'd given him on the Tuesday evening in week 5. I could have said, probably nothing, and moved on. Instead, I told him everything I'd found, not the parts about my contact, not the reason I'd been looking, but the data, the full picture, the patterns in the Viral Services payments, the way they traced to a specific operations manager, the timeline, the amount. I told him because he was already looking. That much was clear from the way he listened, from the questions he asked, sharp and precise and going exactly to the places in the data that mattered. I told him because the trail did not lead to him, and I had become increasingly certain of that, and I was tired of sitting across a table from someone and giving them a partial version of the truth. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Greaves, he said, not a question. That's where it leads, yes? How long? The pattern starts about 20 months ago. Before that, the records are cleaner. Before I changed the reporting structure, with a particular kind of controlled anger that wasn't directed at me. I changed the oversight structure on subcontractor approvals 18 months ago. I must have inadvertently created a gap he could use. You couldn't have known. No, he looked at me. What are you going to do with this? I held his gaze. It was not a comfortable question. What do you mean? I mean that you've been doing a level of analysis on these contracts that goes significantly beyond what Meridian Blue requires, he said, with the patient, implacable precision I had come to know very well, which suggests either extraordinary professional conscientiousness or a specific reason. I'd been wondering which it was since week 7. The air in the room felt very still. Week 7, I said, the subcontractor thread you flagged to me. It was too specific, too early. Most analysts would have missed it. You found it in your 5th week, which meant you were looking for it. His voice was level, but there was something careful underneath it. I want you to tell me why, Stewart. This is the moment in any story where the person who has been keeping secrets decides what they are. I had kept secrets before. I had walked away from things before. I was good at it. It was practically a professional qualification. I was also, it turned out, finished. I was placed here, I said, not as a spy exactly, or not only as a spy. I do real data analysis. I've been doing real work. But I was asked to come in and look for evidence of contract irregularities by people who had information that something was wrong. Silence. I was told the senior leadership was likely involved, I continued, because I was apparently committed now and there was no useful stopping point. Specifically you. I've believed for approximately 6 weeks that that was wrong. More silence. He was looking at me with an expression that was very controlled and entirely unreadable, which was the most frightening expression I had ever seen on his face. Why are you telling me this now? He asked. Because you asked directly, and I am constitutionally incapable of lying to a direct question from someone I respect. A pause. And because you were going to figure it out anyway. Week 7, I said, throwing his words back at him gently. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but the particular quality of someone who has been holding tension for a long time and has received information that changes what to do with it. Who sent you? I can't tell you that. Not yet. Possibly ever. But the direction you've given them, what have you told them? What I found. The Viral Services pattern. I've been framing it carefully. I've been buying time, I admitted, because I wasn't sure yet what I was looking at. And now you're sure. The trail leads to Greaves, not to you. He stood up and walked to the window again, and I sat and waited, because there was nothing to do but wait. The city was dark outside. The room was very quiet. You've been here 13 weeks, he said to the window. Yes, and the work you've done, Meridian Blue, the Q3 analysis, the methodology revisions, all real, all genuine. I don't know how to do anything halfway. He turned back, and the expression on his face was still controlled, but underneath it, there was something that might have been rueful, and something that might have been a kind of wary warmth, and something that I couldn't name, but that made my chest feel less solid than usual. What do you want to do now? He asked. About Greaves, I think you need to handle it through proper channels, internal audit, then legal. I can give you a full documentation of everything I found, without the official channel that got me here. A pause. About everything else, I don't know. I understand if you need me to leave. I don't need you to leave, he said. Immediately, no deliberation. I looked at him. What I need, he said, more slowly, is to think. And then I would like to have a conversation, a real one, about what happens next. Which is not a conversation we can have in this meeting room on a Friday evening. When then? Tomorrow. Lunch. The noodle place. He looked at me steadily. Don't disappear, Stuart. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite a command. It landed somewhere in between, in a register I felt, rather than parsed. I won't, I said. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my apartment and turned the conversation over and over, examining it from every angle, the way you examine something fragile. Carefully, looking for the break, finding instead that the thing you expected to shatter was holding in a shape you hadn't anticipated. He hadn't reacted with anger. He'd reacted with the controlled, precise focus of someone sorting through information they hadn't chosen to receive and deciding what to do with it, which was, I thought, entirely in character, and which told me something about the kind of person he was that no file or surveillance could have told me. I called my contact at 7 in the morning and told him what had happened. Not all of it, the professional parts. There was a long silence on his end. You told him. I told him what was relevant to his business and what he needed to know to handle the actual problem, which is Greaves. The Ventana contract irregularities were real and they're actionable. He can deal with them properly now. This wasn't the arrangement. No, I agreed. It wasn't. But the arrangement was based on a premise that turned out to be wrong, and I think you know that. Another silence. Then, your involvement is concluded. We'll take what you found and proceed through appropriate channels. Good. He hung up. I made coffee and stood at the window and watched the morning arrive over the city, and felt the particular lightness of someone who has put down something they've been carrying too long and is slowly becoming aware of how heavy it was. The noodle place was quieter at lunch than it was in the evenings. We sat at the same table by the window, and the cold December light came in at an angle and made everything look slightly more significant than it usually did, which was inconvenient. He arrived exactly on time. He sat down. He ordered the same thing he always ordered, which I had learned to anticipate, and he looked at me with those dark eyes and said, I spent last night being angry. That seems reasonable. At Greaves. Some of it at the people who sent you without a complete picture. A pause. Very little of it at you. Very little. Some. He almost smiled. You lied to me for 13 weeks. I performed a role. I also did real work, built real things, and told you the truth when it mattered. When it mattered to you to tell it. Yes, I'm not claiming it was straightforward. He was quiet for a moment. No, it wasn't, and neither is this. He looked at me. I want to know what it was, what you were doing while you were here, beyond the assignment. I thought about Danny and the Q4 forms, about Ben's laugh and Callum's careful trust, about the meeting room on the south side in the afternoon light, and the noodle place in November, and 11 minutes in a kitchen on the 15th floor, talking about methodology. I was working, I said, and then I was being somewhere. I stopped expecting to leave, I stopped wanting to. I held his gaze. I think you know what that means, and I think we should probably say it plainly. I've known since around week 8, he said. What I didn't know was what to do with it, given that I didn't entirely understand what you were. I'm a data analyst who got tangled up in something more complicated than he planned for. You're someone who told me the truth when it cost you something. Yes. The food arrived. We ate for a few minutes in a silence that was not uncomfortable. It had that quality of silences between people who have been honest with each other and are processing what that means, which is different from the silence of people who have nothing to say. Then he said, I'd like you to stay. At the company. At the company. A beat. And, other than that too, in whatever arrangement makes sense, I'm aware this is a significant thing to say to someone over noodles. I've had significant conversations in worse settings, I said, and he smiled properly this time, the one that made the room feel warmer. I had been wanting to see that smile in a context where I wasn't performing anything, and here it was. Finish the project, he said. Handle the Greaves situation. I'll need your documentation, done legitimately. And then, he considered, and then let's figure out the rest from there. That's a very measured approach. I find measured approaches useful. You appear to as well, when you're not doing something completely chaotic, like accepting a covert assignment and then developing feelings about it. The feelings were not part of the plan. No, I suspect they rarely are. I looked at him across the small table, in the winter light, feeling something I recognized from very early in my life and had trained myself out of over the years. The feeling of being in the right place, of fitting into a specific context in a way that was not performance and not coincidence, but something chosen, even if the choosing had happened gradually and without full awareness. I'd like to stay, I said. The Greaves investigation took 6 weeks to handle properly. I produced the full documentation, working with Joshua and the company's legal team, and the appropriate reports went to the appropriate authorities through the appropriate channels. My contact called once more to confirm that the information had been received and the matter was being handled. He sounded, I thought, slightly impressed, which was probably the most I was going to get. I stayed. Not without difficulty. There was a period after the Greaves thing became known internally, after the nature of my arrival became clear to a small number of people who needed to know, when I sat with the discomfort of having been a person who was not fully honest with the people around me, and I didn't try to reason myself out of that discomfort or excuse it away. I let it sit, and I worked through it the way you work through any honest reckoning, by doing things differently from here. With Danny and Ben and Callum and Marcus and Yolanda, I told each of them privately, in a version appropriate to what they'd actually experienced and what they deserved to know. The conversations were hard in different ways, and none of them were as hard as I'd feared. Danny hugged me, which I wasn't expecting. Ben told me I was an idiot, and then asked if I was staying and seemed satisfied when I said yes. Callum said very little, but put his hand on my shoulder briefly in a way that said more than words. Yolanda looked at me with the particular expression of someone who had suspected something along these lines for months and was glad to have been right. The company itself moved through the Greaves situation and came out the other side changed in the ways that things change when a weakness is found and addressed, firmer, more transparent about the specific systems that had failed, with a clearer understanding of where the gaps had been. Joshua handled it the way he handled everything, thoroughly, directly, and with more concern for doing it right than doing it fast. What I mean to say, when I describe that winter and the slow spring that followed, is not a summary of events, but something harder to write and more necessary. I mean to describe the way a Tuesday evening can become important, the way two people can build a shared language out of a specific kind of precision and dry humor, and a mutual intolerance for vagueness, until the language becomes a place you both live in. The way trust, which I had spent years deciding was more trouble than it was worth, turns out to be the only thing that makes the other things possible. Joshua was not an easy person to love, not in the sense of being unkind. He was not unkind, but he was exacting in the same way with the people close to him as he was with everything else, which meant that proximity required honesty, and honesty required being the kind of person who could be honest, and I had spent years being very specifically not that kind of person. What I found was that honesty, like most skills, improves with practice, and that the particular quality of being seen accurately by someone, all the parts, including the ones you'd rather present differently, is uncomfortable, and then gradually, the most comfortable thing in the world. We did not rush. We were both, I think, people who had learned to be cautious about the things they let matter to them, and we moved at the pace of mutual trust rather than the pace of feeling, which was sometimes slower than I wanted, and always the right call. There were dinners that stretched past closing time in warm restaurants. There were early mornings when I'd come in to find he was already at his desk and his coffee was already made, and the specific quality of silence in the building had a different weight because we were both in it. There were arguments about methodology that ended in one of us being demonstrably right and the other conceding it with the kind of grace that takes years to develop. There were evenings in his apartment and evenings in mine, slowly becoming more interchangeable, and the space between two lives becoming something more like a single one. There was the particular joy of working alongside someone at the level where you understand each other's thinking well enough to finish ideas, and the particular joy of being surprised by them anyway, because the best people are always more than you've mapped. A year and a half after I walked into a building on a street full of glass and autumn trees, with a cover story and a covert brief, and the absolute conviction that I would be out in 6 months, having completed an assignment, I was sitting in a meeting room on the 15th floor, the one with the good afternoon light, working through a methodology question with Danny and Ben, while Marcus sent precise corrective comments via email from 3 floors away, and Joshua was visible through the glass wall of his office, making a call that I could tell from his expression was going reasonably, but not ideally. And I was aware of all of these things simultaneously in the way you're aware of the elements of somewhere you've lived long enough that they've become the furniture of your consciousness. My contact had not called in 4 months. The Greaves matter was fully resolved. The Ventana contracts had been reviewed and retendered, and the company had come through the process with its reputation intact, partly because of how Joshua had handled it, and partly because the story, in the end, was not one of institutional corruption, but of a specific bad actor and an organization that had corrected itself. I had a desk in the strategy wing that was legitimately mine. I had a role that was not a cover, but a job I was genuinely good at and genuinely cared about doing well. I had colleagues who had become something more than colleagues, in the accumulative way of people who spend enough time together doing real things. I had a life in this city that had stopped feeling provisional. And I was still finding words for this part, which was new enough that the language hadn't settled yet. I had someone who looked at me across small tables in warm restaurants and made the room feel warmer by doing so. Someone who asked hard questions and waited for the real answers. Someone who had decided, having received the full accounting of who I was and what I'd done, that this was sufficient, more than sufficient. Danny said something that made Ben groan in the specific way that meant he found it funny and didn't want to admit it. Marcus sent another email. In his office, Joshua finished his call and looked up and caught me watching him through the glass, and something crossed his face that I had learned to read. A small, private warmth, the expression of someone who has seen you and is not looking away. I went back to my work. The afternoon light moved across the room. The building hummed and breathed around me. Outside, the city was doing whatever it did, going on, full of people in the middle of their own accumulations, their own slow architectures of belonging. I had taken the job to spy on his company. His company had started feeling like home. And then, the part I hadn't planned for, the part that turned out to be the whole story, his company had actually become one. Not because a place is 4 walls and a familiar commute, not because belonging is the absence of difficulty or the end of complicated questions, but because of the specific people who ask you to be honest and wait while you figure out how, and the specific work that matters because it's real, and the specific quality of winter light in a meeting room in a building you chose to stay in, on a day when you could have left and didn't. That is what home turns out to be. At least for me, at least for now, at least for as long as I can keep being the person who tells the truth when it costs something, and stays when staying is the harder thing, which I intend to be for a very long time. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.